in 2 minutes. I would just like to make sure that you all hear me well. If you hear me, please tick the green tick so we can make sure that everything will be perfect when we start. I'll just stop the recording for now. Okay, welcome dear participants to the 7th virtual summer school with the title Think Globally, Live Virtually. My name is Natasha Rifonia. I'm a program manager and also at the same time head of the summer school program. We offer different courses in our summer school, and this year we have over 350 participants from 29 different countries. A warm welcome to our guest tonight, to Amy Armstrong from England, who will be holding the opening lecture of the virtual summer school with the title Think with Compassion, Live with Resilience. This opening lecture will argue that we need to find ways of being kinder to ourselves in order to live with resilience and to successfully navigate our way through life and work pressures. This lecture will introduce the concept of resilience and why it is important. Amy Armstrong is a member of faculty at Ashridge College. Her research and teaching interests include well-being, personal resilience, engagement, compassion, and mental health at work. Amy is also interested in the concept of reflexibility and reflexive practice among managers as means of self-development. She holds a first-class bachelor's degree, an MBA, and a PhD. She is also a visiting fellow at Aston University, and she leads research for Engage for Success, a government-led movement which is seeking to improve engagement and well-being levels across the UK. Well, Amy, welcome again.
Thanks, Natasha.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that this is going to be a very, very interesting webinar tonight, and hereby I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this opening lecture of the summer school. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. As Natasha said, I specialise in both teaching and research in the areas of resilience, well-being and engagement at work. For once, it's not a good thing that so many organisations and individuals are interested in the concept of resilience. Stress levels are rising. It's a common phenomenon now. And I'm interested in the concept that I call suffering overspill, which is this idea that the whole person goes to work, and despite our best intentions, we can't separate our personal and professional lives when we walk through the door at work. And any struggles or challenges we face in our home lives inevitably affect our motivation, our performance, our relationships at work. But the sad reality is that many organisations fail to acknowledge this and often act without compassion or understanding. What I'm hoping to do in this session is to make it as interactive as possible. I'd like it to be that way. Despite it being virtual, I would like us to start a conversation. So I would like to invite you at certain points, please, to contribute to the discussion by offering your own thoughts on the topic. Please don't be shy. It will make for a much better presentation and session if we're able to establish a conversation. So please use the chat box. You can also raise your hand or enable yourself to talk by pressing the talk icon at the top. Okay. I'd just like to give you some context as to why I decided to focus this opening lecture of your summer school around resilience and compassion. One defining characteristic in our modern lives, I think, is the expectation that we believe exists from our workplace, our families, or even ourselves, that despite our struggles, we need just to keep going. In many organisations, there's still a long hours culture, and it's competition between individuals to get ahead. As a consequence, in many societies, stress levels are rising, individual well-being levels are decreasing, and as the most recent Gallup worldwide survey revealed, only 13% of us feel engaged in our work. So that, to me, is a very depressing statistic. And some research that I conducted recently showed that this kind of environment, with its short-termism and its focus on outputs, can lead to what I call toxic leadership behaviours, such as acting in self-interest or an inability of leaders to show their vulnerability. And there's been a number of high-profile cases in the media recently which highlight the impact of such pressure-driven cultures, like Antonio Horta Osorio, who is the group CEO of Lloyd's. He was treated for exhaustion soon after being appointed. And these beliefs and associated behaviours are unsustainable, I would argue, and there needs to be a new way of looking at leadership. I'd just like to highlight the quote that I've put at the bottom of this first slide. For decades, we've encouraged leaders to take ownership of cognitive culture. Leaders would do well to think about and take ownership of their emotional culture. So this is why I think both compassion and resilience are so important. Okay. Against this context that I've just talked about, I'd like to propose that we need to find new ways of being kinder to ourselves. If we're able to find ways of developing resilience and compassion, this can help us to navigate our way through life and work pressures. So looking at the agenda, we'll begin by reflecting on our own sources of pressure, and that's what I'd like you to do in a moment. I'll be inviting you to feedback on that, and as I said before, if you'd like to contribute by adding your thoughts to the chat box or clicking on the talk icon, that would be fantastic. We're also going to conduct a poll during the webinar, so we'll be asking you to click on the yes or no later on in the session to gather your thoughts and poll around resilience. Excuse me. So after we've reflected on our sources of pressure, the lecture will then introduce the concepts of resilience and compassion and discuss why they're so important. Then what I'm going to do is offer you a personal resilience model. There's 4 resources that we can draw on as individuals to help ourselves to become more resilient. And finally, I'm going to talk about the importance of one of those resources, and that's the power of what we call social support, and introduce the relational side of resilience by presenting a model of compassion at work. So I hope that sounds okay to you. I'm hoping that you're all happy, because that's the only plan I have. I don't have another plan. So let's go. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is just to spend the next 3 minutes on your own, in silence, just sitting with your own thoughts and reflecting on what is putting you under pressure at the moment. I'd like you to write them down for yourself. I don't want you to vet them for relevancy. I don't want you to analyse them in any way or question what you write down. Just put down your thoughts as a stream of consciousness as the ideas come to you. So I'm going to give you some silence for 3 minutes while you think about and note down the things that are putting you under pressure at the moment, please. Okay, taking 1 more minute, please. Okay. Just going to give a little longer, just for you to reflect. Okay. What I'd like you to do now, hopefully, you've all been able to reflect and make some notes to yourself about the things that are putting you under pressure at the moment. I'd like you to reflect on the things that you noted down for yourself, and I'd like you to think about how many of the pressures you wrote down are about work, how many of those pressures are about your home life, how many are internally focused and are just about you, how many are externally focused and are about your relationships with others. Okay, so just take a look at them. How many are about work? How many are about your home life? How many are internally focused for yourself? And how many are about your relationships with others? Would anyone like to offer up now any observations or thoughts about your list of pressures? If anyone would like to offer up, please raise your hand or type any thoughts into the chat box.
Two students already wrote something in the chat. Amy, should I read?
Oh, yes, I can't see that. So
okay, you have to go down. One of the students, Amira, she said exam and work puts her under pressure. And one of the students, Daniela, she wrote that all are associated with the job.
Okay.
And again, one student, Miranda, also wrote down my job. Now the answers are coming.
Yeah.
So if you scroll down, you can find all the answers in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I can see. Yeah. Yeah.
But the most I see that are associated with the job and
with work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, and then there's some.
But some are mostly internally focused student emails.
Oh, that's interesting from Amy about finding an organisation where my values are identified. That's interesting, that one, because later on when we talk about the resources that you can draw on for yourself to help to become more resilient, one of those resources is around purpose. And we know, research tells us that one of the most depleting factors for our resilience at work is when we lose a sense of purpose, or when we work in an organisation where our values don't fit those of the organisation. That's hugely depleting. So that's interesting that that one was raised. Okay. That's similar, actually, I think, from Ekaterina. Finding my place in work and life, that's about purpose. Okay. Insufficient time for family, yeah. Daniela. Okay, and it's this idea that I talked about before, that it's difficult to separate your home and work life. Whatever pressures we're feeling spill to one or the other, and so we can't separate them despite our intentions or our efforts to do so. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the next slide. And what I'd like to do is, we've thought about our sources of pressure. I'd now like you to think about what we're discussing this evening. When you read that the opening lecture was on the topic of resilience and compassion, what did you think it would be about? You're obviously interested in the topic, and that's why you're here. What words come to mind for you when you hear the word resilience? I'd like you to type them, please, into the chat box. How would you define resilience? And then we'll reflect on them, and I'll offer up 3 definitions. What is resilience to you? Okay. Yeah. I'm just making notes for myself as they come in so I can make some comments. Yeah. These are great, thank you. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so we've got things like contentment, coping with adversity, personal strength, adaptability, and that includes, somebody mentioned something about multitasking, resisting stress, something about strength again, yeah, and something about not taking things personally, yeah, about your ego, yeah, ego depletion, yeah. Just a few things I'd like to say about resilience. I think, firstly, where resilience has gone wrong, in my view, is where resilience is positioned as being about strength. So many people talk about resilience as being about strength, but resilience is actually as much about being able to acknowledge your limitations as it is about strength. Resilience is as much about self-awareness and knowing your limitations, knowing your vulnerabilities and acknowledging them, as it is about strength, if that makes sense. Resilience research started in the 1950s, actually, among children, with the belief that you're born resilient or you're not. So it was a personality-based or a trait-based view of resilience. Research has moved a long way since then, and we now understand resilience to be a state as well as a trait. So there are personality characteristics that predispose people to become more resilient or not, such as naturally optimistic people or extroverts are more likely to be resilient. But what we know about resilience now is that that's only 40% of the story. 60% of our resilience is built through life experience, and we can actually develop our resilience, become more resilient over time, which is good news because there are things that we can do to help ourselves. Now, the other observation I want to make before offering up 3 definitions of resilience, and this links exactly to Pedja's point in the chat box, resilience is often seen as bounce back or the ability to rebound from setbacks. There's a huge body of research that sees resilience as recovery or bounce back. But my view is that actually resilience isn't about bounce back. Through difficult experiences in our life, we actually become different as a result. We don't revert back or bounce back to an original state or the way that we were before. Due to difficult experiences, we're actually different as a result. So in my view, resilience isn't about bounce back or recovery, it's about change in some way. Just one final observation before I give you some definitions is resilience is, somebody's mentioned adaptability. That we'll cover later on. That's one of the 4 resilience resources that we can draw on to help ourselves to become more resilient. So it's good news. There are things we can do, and so that's quite important to know. Okay, so let me offer up some definitions. So this first one is where I've just said there's a body of work that views resilience as recovery or bounce back. But for the reasons I've just said, I don't believe resilience is about that. I believe there's something different, however small, about our experience as a result of stress and pressure. The second definition is a more, I suppose, scientific definition of resilience, looking at the property of a material that resumes its shape. But the reason I've put that up there is this bottom part in bold, which is resilience as elasticity. Now, this is really important when thinking about resilience in the context of your leadership or management roles. If any of you are managers and you have a team of people that you look after, one of the really interesting things about resilience research when it comes to teams is that if a manager fails to flex their style of management depending on the context and the people they're managing, teams feel that their resilience is depleted. Does that make sense? That's why resilience is about elasticity. So that's the ability to flex your style of management depending on the person you're dealing with or the situation you're in. Okay. And the third definition of resilience is about, and this is where my work sits, and this is where my definition of resilience would come in. Resilience is about learning. So if you're unable to take a situation that you've found stressful, you're unable to learn from that and do something differently next time, you're not helping yourself, in my view, to become more resilient as a result. I hope that makes sense. Just want to also say at this point that resilience is different from stress management. Stress management, to me, is reactionary and it's short-term. Resilience is about being proactive and taking steps for the long term. We know that resilience can be developed, and I'll be presenting the 4 resilience resources later on. So I'd like you to also think about resilience as having a proactive element. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Okay. I'm going to give an opportunity for questions at the end, by the way, so please make a note of your questions and then I'll address it at the end. Okay, what we're going to do now is just to run a short poll. Now I'm going to explain how this is going to work. This is about you thinking about resilience being proactive. and steps that you can take to help yourself to become more resilient for the longer term. It is a fun exercise, okay? I just want you to take it in that way, in that spirit. But I'd like you to tick yes in the poll if the following statements apply to you. I'm going to read 6 statements, and I want to see how resilient you all are today. Okay? So please tick yes only if the statement applies to you. If it doesn't, please tick no. Okay? I'm now going to read 6 statements. It's just a fun exercise to see how resilient you are today. Okay, the first statement. Please tick yes if you've had the right amount of sleep for at least 10 out of the last 14 nights. Okay, they're coming in, yeah.
Okay, we have 10 answers right now. So, okay, the answers are coming. This is going to be interesting. We will also show you the results, right, Amy? When you're ready, I will then show the results. Now, 14 answers. I hope that everybody has found the tick to be able to answer this question.
It is anonymous.
Okay. Okay. Let's show the results of this first statement.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I do a lot of work with a lot of different organisations on the topic of resilience, and often this first statement is a high proportion of people saying no. So it's interesting that more people in this session feel that they're getting the right amount of sleep, because what we find when we think about our physiological resilience, when people are at their most busy at work, one of the first things to go is sleep, with people working longer, being distracted more by mobile technology and therefore not physically switching off. So it's interesting that this poll is counter that, although for those of you who didn't respond, it would be interesting to see if that flipped it, so that more people felt that they weren't getting the right amount of sleep and it would still remain the same. So we don't know, actually, with so many of you not responding. Okay, let's try the next one. Okay, the next one is tick yes, please, if you've sought and received developmental feedback at work in the last 2 weeks and have acted on it. So you've asked for feedback about yourself at work in the last 2 weeks and have acted on it.
Okay, 10 more seconds and then we will show the results. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so this one's coming up as that more people have not sought and received
developmental feedback at work in the last 2 weeks and have acted on it. This is interesting because this directly connects to what I was just talking about in terms of what resilience is. If resilience is about learning, and it's also about self-awareness, we're not helping ourselves to become more resilient if we're not asking for feedback, becoming more self-aware about how we're coming across at work. So yeah, it's interesting that that one is coming out as a negative. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this one. You've discussed a work-related stressor with at least one family member in the last 2 weeks. Okay, please tick yes if you've discussed something about work that's making you feel under pressure or stressed with at least one family member in the last 2 weeks.
Okay, 10 more seconds and then we will show the results. Okay, and here are the results.
Wow, okay. So this directly connects to one of the resilience resources that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, around the power of social support. There's a huge body of evidence now around the power of family, friends and work colleagues when you're able to what's called vent or verbally express your stressors rather than keeping them to yourself. The ability to share or vent those frustrations can be really helpful when it comes to building resilience. I should just say actually at this point that resilience is highly individual. So what helps one person to become more resilient doesn't necessarily help another person. And that's why resilience has to start with self-awareness. Venting or talking to others about your frustrations isn't for everyone, but it can be helpful for some people. Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, this one. You've exercised for at least 30 minutes, 3 or more times per week in the last 2 weeks. Tick yes if you've exercised for at least 30 minutes, 3 or more times per week in the last 2 weeks.
Okay, 10 more seconds to decide whether you've been active or not. Okay, and here are the results.
Okay, so it's a fairly even split. I just want to make a quick comment about this. We all know what exercise does for us in the short term anyway, in terms of building it releases endorphins, which is a pleasure hormone, helps us to feel, at least in the short term, that it's a buffer for stress. Okay, next one. You've discussed a work-related stressor with at least one work colleague in the past 2 weeks. Now this is about your levels of social support at work. How many of you talk to work colleagues about work stresses?
Okay, 10 more seconds to decide. All right. And here are the results.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like you all have a supportive work environment in the sense that you're discussing work-related stresses with work colleagues, which is great. What I'd be interested in actually to see if this changed, if I asked you, have you discussed a home-related stressor with at least one work colleague? Okay. And finally, you've eaten convenience food, junk food on less than 2 occasions in the last 2 weeks. Wow, you are a healthy and fit bunch. This is very unusual, actually.
Yes, it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Now let's see the results.
Yeah. Oh, it's coming out as sort of fairly even actually now. All the answers have come in. Okay, I just want to make some observations. This is a fun exercise, but it outlines some of the physiological and social factors that we know help when it comes to resilience. The first one is sleep. We know now through extensive research that the amount and the quality of sleep that you have significantly affects your ability to perform effectively at work. And it's quite worrying actually when you look at the statistics around, particularly around top management teams, and the level of judgment that is impaired by poor quality and lack of sleep. So if there was one thing, if you tick no here, that if there's one thing that you take away from this session, it might be to look at sleep, because it's the single most important factor physiologically anyway when it comes to your resilience. Okay, learning. That was my definition of resilience. If you're unable to take a situation, learn from it and do something differently next time, you're not helping yourself to become more resilient for the longer term. Home support and work support. I'm going to talk about social support in a second within the resilience resources model, and I'm also going to look at social support through the lens of compassion at the end of this presentation. Hugely beneficial to have a network of support at home and at work when it comes to managing stress and pressure. And we know about the power of exercise and diet, but just one observation that I see when I come across management populations and groups, that when people are busiest and under most pressure, the first 3 things to go tend to be their sleep, their diet and their exercise. And I would argue that fundamentally there, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sleep, diet and exercise are right at the bottom of the hierarchy. They're our basic needs, and so many people are failing to look after those most basic needs, which is quite worrying. Okay, another moment for reflection now. I'd just like you to take just a couple of minutes to reflect on the exercise that we've just done. Just take a moment for yourself to think about each of those statements in turn, and perhaps write down for yourself one action that you can commit to start looking after yourself more. So I'm just going to go back to the previous slide and leave it with you just for a couple of minutes to think about any of those 6 and an action that you might take to help yourself to look after yourself a little more. Just leave you for 2 minutes. Okay. So I'm not going to ask you to share any of the commitments that you may have made for yourself, there for your own personal use. Instead, what I'd like to do now is move on, and I'd like to introduce the 4 personal resilience resources that individuals can draw on to help build their own resilience. Okay, so this is a model that's been developed by one of my colleagues, actually at Ashridge, and builds on extensive research into the factors that we can develop for ourselves to help us to become more resilient in the longer term. Just moving round the circles from the top. At the top there is self-confidence. Right at the beginning of the session I said that resilience starts with self-awareness and self-confidence, and this is about you building a realistic and positive belief about yourself and your ability to influence things for the better. Now that realistic and positive sense of self will only come through feedback. So if you ticked no on the question earlier around receiving feedback from work and acting on it, then that's perhaps an action that you might take away. Because this, we know, is helpful for building confidence, and that's one of the important resilience resources. What I'd like you to do when I've talked through all 4 of them is to think about which area you might be most depleted, and therefore which of the 4 resources you might want to focus on. And to help you do that, I would suggest you look back to the sources of pressure that you identified right at the beginning. If the sources of pressure were mostly internally focused, then you might think about confidence as being the resource perhaps where you're most depleted, and therefore the one that you need to focus on. Okay? Moving to the right, social support. I've talked a little bit about that. This is about taking care of the relationships at home and at work that restore and sustain you when you're feeling particularly stressed or under pressure. How often when we're at our busiest do we let go of those relationships which are actually good for us? They help to restore and sustain us. So social support is crucial both at home and at work to help build your resilience. At the bottom, adaptability. Somebody mentioned that earlier on when I asked for your definitions of resilience. We know that people who are flexible and adaptable, they're able to change their management style depending on the situation that they're in or the person that they're dealing with, help themselves to become more resilient for the longer term. It also helps with adaptability to generate new ideas or create solutions, to problem solve or improvise. And the 4th, purpose. I know Amy mentioned that earlier. I know some others did too when you were defining resilience. What's interesting about resilience and work, the single most depleting factor on our personal resilience at work is when we lose a sense of purpose. And that's about understanding who we are and what we believe and value, and working out what really matters to you. When we lose that sense at work, it's hugely depleting. Equally, when we're asked to act outside our values or do something that we don't believe in, that's depleting also. So purpose is absolutely crucial. And when people have lost a sense of purpose with their work, if that continues for a long period, then I would start to question whether people are working in the right environment for them. Okay? Of these 4 resources, what I'd like to do for the last or the final part of this lecture is to concentrate on one of them, and that's social support. There's a huge amount of evidence around the power of social support, and these positive relationships I would argue, are built through compassion. Okay, so what is compassion? It connects directly to personal resilience because compassion starts with the self. Remember the yes exercise that we've just done and the poll we just took around the statements of resilience. Self-compassion is about you exercising a healthy level of selfishness, I suppose. If you don't look after yourself, then you're going to be no good to anyone else. And I liken it to the analogy of, you know, when you're on an aeroplane and they say, put your own mask on before helping others. That to me is self-compassion. You need to look after yourself first, because otherwise you can't look after others. Compassion goes further than empathy, and I'll talk through a model of compassion in a second. It goes further than empathy because it's not just about understanding another person or understanding the self. It's also about taking action to try and alleviate suffering or to build resilience. Another defining characteristic of compassion is that disclosure is at the heart of building compassionate connections. If you have the courage to disclose something about your personal vulnerability, then this quickly builds trust and connection between people and builds compassion. And as a manager, I would argue it requires careful observation to be a compassionate manager. Often things are going on under the surface of team members that they're suppressing or they're not showing at work. And it's a manager who truly understands their people who is able to act with compassion. Okay, I just want to offer up a model of compassion at work. This is by some colleagues at the University of Michigan. They suggest that compassion is a three-way process of noticing another person's suffering, feeling empathy for them, and then responding by taking action to try and help them in some way. This model takes compassion beyond empathy. However, I think it's limited in the following ways. It's, for example, it's one perspective, and what we know about compassion is that it's relational, it's two-way. In order for compassion to happen, there needs to be a compassion giver and a compassion receiver. And this is just from the perspective of someone who's offering or giving compassion. It also, this model, it assumes that suffering is observable, but sometimes suffering is hidden. People don't show their true feelings at work. It's also context-free, and we know that compassion doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I'd like to offer up a model of compassion that I've developed that sees compassion as relational. It's two-way. So you can see on the left in the blue is the original model of compassion. What this model does is extend it to look at compassion from both the giver and the receiver. It's not just about noticing and feeling and responding. We don't always notice. Suffering may be hidden. On the right-hand side, you can see that it requires trust for someone to disclose their suffering. If there's mistrust, someone might withhold and not talk about their struggles. Therefore, compassion interaction is not possible. The moment of disclosure is absolutely pivotal, and the reaction of the compassion giver makes or breaks compassion at work, so it's very fragile. It takes sensitivity and an intimate knowledge of an individual on the part of the compassion giver to be able to respond appropriately. Okay, so it's really complex and it's not as obvious as it seems. So to bring compassion into focus in organisations, I'd argue three things that I'd like you to perhaps take away with you when thinking about compassion and its connection to resilience. Firstly, compassion is born from when we share life lessons. My research has shown that difficult life experiences like critical illness or bereavement can be a catalyst for learning or growth at work, with managers reporting that they become more compassionate as a result of their own struggles. But disclosure is at the heart, so we need to encourage each other, leaders and managers, to have courage to share their struggles and to talk about them at work, because this builds trust and connection and fosters what I would argue is an emotionally healthier work environment. Compassion starts with the self, but it's difficult to connect and care for others if we don't exercise kindness to ourselves, and that was the purpose of the yes poll. In today's environment, we often find that managers are highly self-critical. People tend to really beat themselves up. However, if you just try and take some time for positive self-reflection, perhaps starting to take notes each day of 3 things that are positive about your work or home life, we can start to develop kinder ways of looking at ourselves. And by becoming more self-accepting and with a positive self-regard, that builds that resilience resource of confidence that I talked about earlier. Thirdly, compassionate managers are careful observers. It takes, if some of you are managers and you do have people that you look after in your teams, it does take time, energy and courage to be compassionate. You need to get to know your staff intimately to understand and acknowledge that there might be stuff that's going on under the surface that's affecting their productivity and their performance at work. But you need to have a relationship of trust with them in order to understand that. Compassionate managers, I would also argue, encourage their teams to nurture their own social support network. So that's the right-hand side of the resilience resources model. If managers encourage their people to develop their network of relationships that restore and sustain them, this helps because we know the support of colleagues is a critical component of compassionate work. Okay, so just to close, what I'd like to say is compassion is more than being kind to one another. Compassion also builds the bottom line. We know from research that compassionate work cultures have happier, more engaged people. Their customers stay longer, there's better teamwork, lower levels of absence, and higher levels of retention. So there's all sorts of reasons why it's important that we build compassionate and resilient organisations. That's the end of the presentation. I hope that it was thought-provoking and useful for you. I'd love to invite your questions, thoughts, comments. I appreciate we're rapidly running out of time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, if you have any.
Amy, there were some comments coming at the end of your presentation. If you just could have a look.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just managed, I'm looking at your comments from earlier, my apologies, I was so focused on the presentation. I'm seeing your comments about sleep. Yeah. Yeah. Will the slides be lit? Yes. I'm sure they'll be available. Sorry, I'm just catching up with all your comments now. Oh yeah, Katerina's comment. Yeah, many people never fully understand what's happening to others. That's absolutely. They're caught in their own feelings. That's interesting. Responding is the crucial part. People notice many things. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, Gregor's comment about it happening in many companies. Compassion, be passionate. Yeah, there's interesting debates in the academic literature about compassion and love and the difference between them. And actually, they're very, very similar. There's an overlap between compassion and love. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Daniela's comment. Sometimes you notice and you want to help, but people don't want help. That's absolutely a great observation, that what we know about difficult life experiences is that some people come to work to cope and to get a sense of normality in their lives, which may otherwise be in absolute chaos. And so actually they don't want to talk about it, they want to compartmentalise, which is a way of coping when they're at work. And that's absolutely right, Daniela, but it takes a good manager, a compassionate manager, to know that individual well enough to know that they're coming to work to cope. Otherwise, how do they know that? You need to understand someone intimately, I would argue, to know whether it's right to allow them just to compartmentalise and to forget momentarily while they're at work, or to address it. Okay. So Katerina's comment, I might just disagree with the necessity of proactive approach because it needs to be some extent, especially in professional environments. Katerina, are you able to talk just so you can explain what you mean?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah, that's Katerina. If I understood you right, you asked me to talk, to explain, right?
Yes, please, that would be great.
I just meant that sometimes too much compassion in an organization can be even a problem, because if a manager is too compassionate, he might just not be strict enough with his co-workers, and they start complaining more and more about things. So it might provoke them for more complaining. That's what I meant.
This is, Katerina, what a brilliant observation. This is so true, and it's why people need to start, when I talked about resilience, start with themselves. Because if you have self-awareness and you understand your own personality, if you know you're naturally an empathic or caring person that tends to take on the stresses or emotions of others, you need to find ways of yourself as a manager offloading. We find this a lot in the caring profession, so people who are doctors, nurses, etc. And there's a phenomena called compassion fatigue, which is where the individual who's the carer becomes depleted themselves because they spend so much time caring for others. So yeah, absolutely that happens, and it's why we need to understand ourselves and understand how we as managers can protect ourselves from that. Thanks, Katerina, that was brilliant.
Thank you too for the comment.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at Amy's comment now. You mentioned self-awareness is important. You can get this through developmental feedback, but it's difficult to know what you should take on board and what is subjective criticism. Yeah, because this can lead to a loss of confidence. Yeah, so what I would say there is I think it's important to get triangulation or feedback from more than one person so that you can start to build up a picture as to whether something's subjective or actually it's something that reflects reality in terms of the way that you're coming across at work. So this is where 360-degree feedback is helpful, Amy. Okay. So John? Yeah, what should be done to implement them? It's a great question, I think, and what I argue in much of the work that I do is that it takes the courage of people in positions of power to start behaving in this way, to set the example and to lead from the top. So that sets a culture for others to follow. I think leaders and managers need to lead by example, and it's great when you see leaders who are acknowledging their own vulnerability, sharing struggles of their own and saying, do you know what, I'm human too, and you know, we all are, because then that sets an environment in which people know that emotions can be shown and shared. Thanks, John. Okay, Greta, thanks for the feedback. That's great. I'm glad it was useful. Yeah, thanks for the feedback, Sabina and Andrea. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, John, again for your copious feedback. That's great. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Peja. Yeah, this is a good point from Daniela. A good manager has to find the time to listen, but does not have to be best friends with an employee. Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Daniela. Yeah. Amy, thank you. Yeah, I agree, John. Yeah, I agree, and particularly when John's saying that compassion's gone from the world in many places. I agree, and I think in some of the research I've done, the human resource department comes out really badly when it comes to this stuff. Human resources has moved away from human and has in many organisations just become about resources and moved away from what it used to be around supporting people and compassion. Thanks, Nadia. And Ines, thank you for the feedback. Okay. Unless anyone else has any other comments, I'll suggest we close the lecture. It's now nearly 8:10, so I know I've gone over, Natasha. Sorry about that, but I think it was really great to just look through that feedback and to get your comments.
Well, thank you, Amy, for this interesting lecture. You could see from the comments of our students that they really loved it. I hope we will be able to host you again in the future, Amy.
Absolutely, love to. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you all for listening to us tonight, and I wish you a very pleasant evening, and I would like to invite you to all other webinars we are organizing in the Virtual Summer School, and Amy, also bye-bye to England.
Thank you, yeah, bye to you too. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Good night.